Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about China, and that's the reason. Now, I knew that there was a reason why students kept coming to my door, and now I know it's because it's Jesse itself. So when I first started studying China and its military and technological power in the 1970s, I think this was when I was from kindergarten onwards. So that's how I like to think about it itself. And I went and I talked to the professors who looked at this area or looked at security studies in general. And they said, it's like, well, your topic, this was in the 70s and even in the 80s, is about as relevant as the study of Greenland as a beach destination. And I said, okay, I may be on the wrong track, but I'm going to persist because I think at some point it's going to be relevant today. And fortunately or unfortunately, today, the issue of China's military and technological rise has tumbled sort of from the back pages to the front pages of both the media, of policy and scholarly dialogue itself. And also, should I add, the study of Greenland as a beach resort has also become relevant because of climate change itself. So I'm in good company. And one of the big questions that have come out is, like, I mean, as Jesse sort of mentioned earlier, is are we, it's like, seeing the US and China going to go to war itself? So if anyone sort of followed some of the scholarly writings, there's issues like Graham Allison's validity trap. But the area that I don't actually think that China and the US is going to go into an actual armed kinetic conflict itself. What is more likely, and what we're actually already seeing, is the beginnings or the early chapters of what people are beginning to call a Cold War itself. I mean, what we've seen in the last few years, and particularly accelerated in the last year, is like we see the trade frictions, the economic, the geopolitical and geostrategic issues. And the US officially, it's like in the last year or so, the US government has designated that we're in an era today of great power competition, particularly with China and with Russia itself. So what I'm going to do is to give you a little bit of context and then look at what we mean by sort of what is understanding China in this context of, are we in this Cold War? Because it's a useful term, and there's a historical reference point, but it's actually very, very different. And understanding the differences helps us to sort of begin to pass and sort out what are the challenges and how do we think about it over the next few decades. So the first Cold War that began was in the second half of the 20th century. It was between the Soviet Union and the US, and this took place from the 1950s right up to the beginning of the 1990s itself. And that was sort of a military ideological clash itself, and that was all-consuming. But there was another dimension, and that was what we call the geo-economic. And that was sort of in the 1980s, with the rise of Japan as a technological and an investment and an economic power. And in many ways, this is what was behind the establishment of GPS back in the late 1990s, to study what the Japanese competition meant for the US and for the global order. But the important thing was that this was very compartmentalized. So you had the Soviet Union in this security sphere, and you had Japan on the geo-economic sphere. And there was a very deep divide for political and strategic reasons, etc. There wasn't much of an overlap between them itself. So it's like the big word from this is that the first Cold War was a very compartmentalized affair. Today, what we're seeing with the rise of China, both from an economic and from a strategic and from a military and from a technological perspective, is that China represents a very different challenge to the US. Whereas, on the one hand, the First Cold War was very much of a compartmentalized competition. China represents a very integrated challenge to the US and the rest of the world. It represents both on the national security side, on the defense and military side itself, as well as on the economic. But China is more than just the sum of the Soviet Union and Japan. If China today was the sum of the Soviet Union and Japan, it would be relatively easy because a lot of the legacy approaches that we dealt with during the Cold War, like export controls or investment controls, we could apply to China. But sort of what I think is the main challenge today is sort of like in the middle, the convergence between the defense and the economic, the commercial, to what we call the civil military, and the rise of the emerging core strategic technologies. Because this is one of the areas that China is paying particular attention to. And this represents a very big challenge because this is a very blurred area itself. What used to be in the Cold War, we could sort of very clearly distinguish what was sort of military, or what was commercial. Today it's very blurred. It's like a lot of it was what we call dual use. It has both civil and military applications. This particularly applies to a lot of the emerging areas. And sort of to understand this is we need to understand sort of what is the nature of the Chinese state in all this. And this is a useful environment because I'm going to be able to sell my book, because my book coming up is on what I call the Chinese techno-security state itself. And I'm going to give a very brief overview itself, because the Chinese techno-security state, when we begin to understand it, we begin to understand what are the different actors and what are different elements. Because, I mean, today in the headlines, some of the challenges are, like, I mean, we see issues of this Chinese technology company called Huawei, right? So what is Huawei? If you look at what the US government says, Huawei is a national security threat itself. If you talk to consumers in the rest of the world, they say, well, Huawei, they make some of the best smartphones, etc. It's a commercial enterprise itself. Is it one or the other, etc.? And one of the things for us to begin to understand is understanding what the Chinese techno-security state is. The Chinese techno-security state, which is sort of how technology and innovation and security is beginning to become increasingly integrated. So what you have is that, especially since Xi Jinping has come to power, since the early 2010s, he's made a major effort to emphasize the importance of national security, both externally and domestically, such as like building up the Chinese military power, building up the surveillance and monitoring and control capability domestically. There's also the build-up of traditional defense industrial complex, which is pouring out a lot of KKK capabilities. But it's the rise of this dual-use, strategic innovation system that is focusing on this convergence between the commercial and military, that is really the most fascinating part itself. Xi Jinping is very much engaged in this. He heads a number of entities that are focused upon this. Almost every month he talks about this, etc. And it's like, and this is one of the areas that is very, very little understood. There's very little research. In fact, in the US, there's about 3 or 4 people who are studying this, and none of them are in the Defense Department itself. So, I mean, it's because it's like we need to understand. It's like these issues about it's like where are the boundaries, right? And how do we understand it? So, it's so domestically, Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership talks about how we're going to fuse and converge the military and the commercial portions of the economy to create this dual-use, very integrated, state-led economy. Externally, the Chinese authorities say, don't pay attention to any of that. It's like our companies, the investment firms, etc., they're all commercial. They don't have any ties to the national security apparatus. And some of that might be true, etc. The US, what we see, especially this administration and the national security apparatus here, they are viewing sort of the China view, threat sort of as a black and white, right? It's like, well, obviously it's a national security, and we need to take an absolute approach, have a complete decoupling. While a lot of the US allies, we've seen this week the UK, but Germany and others who say, well, it's, we should take a relative view about what China represents. Yes, there are national security issues, but China and this commercial companies and the technologies that they come, there's a lot of economic benefits and interests. So what we see is these different debates that are taking place, the US, in China, and the rest of the world. And these debates are fierce, and whoever gets to have the final say to define this will have a profound impact on shaping how the global technology order, and by reference also the economic order, what is this going to come out to be? Are we going to have the continuing status quo, a partial or a complete decoupling? And I think a school like GPS is critical as a venue to understand this, because it's not just about military or security issues, right? This is about issues of technology, about political economy, and it's about looking at all these things holistically. And so these are the types of things that we're doing here to be able to say, when we go to Washington, D.C., and we talk to the policymakers, and we say, well, it's like, I mean, you don't really, it's like when you paint China in black and white, this is not really very, very helpful itself. We need to have a much more nuanced view itself. It's sort of the equivalent when I talk to the Defense Department. It's like, well, you take a World War II approach. When you sort of, it's like in the bombing campaigns in World War II, you carpet bombed a lot of sort of your opponents in Germany, etc. And there's a massive collateral damage, etc. Perhaps what you should do is more like today, when you should be much more precise in how you deal with these threats, etc. And it's like, and they don't have the analytical tools or the frameworks or even the evidence to come. And so this is the things that we're trying to do today itself. And I'll leave it on that. Thank you.